Hey everyone, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and what I'm looking at today is the Stellungsnahme zum Projekt Volksjäger, the statement in regards to the project Volksjäger by Willy Messerschmitt. Now this is from October 1944, that's a good date to remember. It'll allow us to place things into context, and as we go through this, just remember that date, October 1944, quite an early date for the Volksjäger project. This is a document that I myself pulled from one of my visits to the German military archives, which is a great place, of course, to visit and get hands-on with these sort of primary sources, these documents that were written at the time. To start off then, this is Willy Messerschmitt talking about the Heinkel He-162 Volksjäger from his competitor, the Heinkel Flugzeugwerke. The He-162 is a rival, in a sense, to Messerschmitt's own Me-262. So obviously there is a competition element to all of this, which Messerschmitt actually addresses. I asked that my support for the Me-262 against the 162 is not judged as company politics. By now we are definitely beyond this point. Well, okay, so of course we have to address this a little bit. I could go at length here about Messerschmitt's, shall we say, reputation. This popular image of him is, of course, that he's this very shrewd, scheming businessman, well connected. And yes, there is some truth to that, although I think it does get exaggerated from time to time, because oftentimes it's easier to say, oh, all of this only happened because Messerschmitt, well, he just pulled some strings, made some calls, and that's it, rather than actually looking at sort of the bureaucratic process that goes into making some of these decisions. But you can already see how we're starting to drift off topic here, so just to pull us back on target for the purposes of this video, just keep in mind these companies are, of course, vying for contracts. There are business interests, but that doesn't mean that what Messerschmitt says in his document, in his statement, is necessarily wrong. As you will see, I'm going to analyze his points and then hopefully that will allow us to expand the scope a little bit here. Now, Messerschmitt starts off by saying, this project to build a cheap jet fighter with the BMW 003A jet engine that will be available in quantity in early 1945 is something I judge to be inappropriate at this stage. No surprise, but let's push on. He lists 4 reasons to back up this statement. First reason is, the technical task assignments are wrong, as the tasks of this Volksjäger can already be solved by existing and tested aircraft available today. So yeah, on a pure technical side, I would agree with Messerschmitt that the Me-262 was the better aircraft. Next to Messerschmitt, most pilots also were against the Heinkel 162. However, the technical dimension, which often gets emphasized nowadays, right, actually has very little relevance when it came to the decision to build the 162. In order for a new small jet fighter to be cheap and easy to build, the fighter staff accepted trade-offs to facilitate production. Despite varied objections, the potential advantages of having a cheap jet airframe available, so cheap as to be disposable, were judged revealingly by the fighter staff to outweigh the recognized risks associated with introducing in the middle of a war an entirely new aircraft type that was untested, inferior in speed, range and weaponry to the Me-262. In early September 1944, Speer's fighter staff called for designs for a single-engine jet fighter to be powered by a single BMW 003 engine. The new fighter revealing was christened the Volksjäger. So this is why, of course, I asked you to remember that date, October 1944, because in this statement, Messerschmitt is reacting to this very announcement. As we will see, the reason why the Heinkel 162 was to be produced had nothing to do with technical or tactical capabilities of the aircraft. It was an attempt to make a cheap, easy to produce jet. And I think Messerschmitt knows that. And he knows that arguments based on sort of technical and tactical concerns are really no longer relevant at the end of 1944, because all his 3 remaining points focus entirely on production. It is unlikely that a newly developed aircraft with all its risks will allow us in early and summer of 1945 to throw enormous quantities of aircraft into the fight. We can, however, build at least the same amount of aircraft of tested types at the same time without having to take into account the risks of a new development and their externalities if we use the extra capacities that have been provided for this plan to increase the output of existing types. It is by now nigh impossible to drive forward the Volksjäger program in such a fashion that we can count on an operational use in great quantities by early 1945. It is an illusion that the 162 can be developed and built with extra capacities without disturbing the existing types, especially the Me-262. The Me-262 continues to stand on a weak foundation. There remains a lack of equipment and provisions, skilled labor, and inspectors. To deep dive into this, let us compare the two machines in terms of production and see how things unfolded. For this, let us look at both airframe and engine production. The series production of the Me-262 started in March, April 1944. Given here are the numbers for the Messerschmitt AG Augsburg and Messerschmitt GmbH Regensburg. Keep in mind that this production is not limited to a single geographic location. In early April 1944, the first series-produced aircraft leave the provisional production lines. The main parts that are assembled here into aircraft originate from different workshops. The main parts themselves are assembled from parts and kits delivered by dispersed sweat and workshops. You can see two things here. First of all, the Augsburg line starts to approach a capacity of 100 airframes in September 1944 and 160 in 1945 before being shut down mid-April. Comparatively, the Regensburg line lags behind. However, these numbers hide a critical problem. Problems with unsafe and poorly constructed engines, combined with manufacturing problems of the Me-262 airframes, meant that of a total 1,433 Me-262 airframes, only about 358 aircraft became operational. Through Allied bombing and strafing attacks, 611 aircraft were damaged and lost. Through special measures, 114 aircraft are repaired, thus the effective loss equals 497 Me-262. This means that compared to airframe production, only a quarter to a third of the total possible Me-262 output was usable to the Germans. Although Germany made a tremendous effort to try to decrease the cost of the Me-262 production, especially through the indiscriminate use of slave labor, this production loss is catastrophic considering the cost of the aircraft and the need to get them to the front lines, especially when compared to the Heinkel 162. The main advantage of the He-162 was its low cost compared to the Me-262. The He-162 took only 1,500 man-hours to produce, whereas an Me-262 airframe at Messerschmitt required 9,000 man-hours. Each Me-262 cost 150,000 Reichsmark, whereas the He-162 cost half as much. The He-162 had a remarkably short development time, which contrasts with Messerschmitt's expectations. However, this is not to say that the development went without problems that are guaranteed to happen when a plane is developed this quickly. Let us look at the timeline. On the 6th of December 1944, the first flight happens, followed a few days later by a crash and the death of the test pilot. Soon, the second prototype is ready. Production is to start in January 1945, but problems with production delays the introduction as most of the completed airframes were useless. And due to the chaos at the end of the war, the production numbers are hard to pinpoint, but it is clear that the Luftwaffe had only received a small number of aircraft. In the 8th to the 11th April period, Erste Gruppe Jagdgeschwader 1 reported it had 10 to 12 aircraft, while Zweite Gruppe Jagdgeschwader 1 was still awaiting any aircraft. The Luftwaffe on the whole had, by this stage, received only around 60 He-162s. While the production gets going quicker than with the Me-262, in large parts due to the urgency and simplicity of the design. The Heinkel 162 is not ready for operational use in April 1944 from a technical perspective. That said, the problems with production get even more clear when we look at engine production. By the end of the war, about 275 He-162s had been completed and about 800 nearly completed. A large proportion never received engines. Talking about engines, let's have a closer look at that. The Me-262 and He-162 had two different engines. The Me-262 had a Jumo 004 and the Heinkel 162 had a BMW 003. Between the two, the main production Jumo engine entered production slowly in early 1944 and the BMW in October 1944. When comparing the engines, I will look at this from a production standpoint. The advantages of the Jumo 004 engine in comparison to the piston engine was that it was quicker to build, less resource intensive and provided more horsepower per man-hour spent in building it. The crucial Jumo 213, Daimler-Benz 603 and BMW 801 engines took approximately 3,000 man-hours to build, whereas the production version of the Jumo 004 engine ultimately required a mere 700 man-hours to build. In its 6 months of operation, the single Nordwerk factory produced 1,955 Jumo 004 jet engines underground. Based on the historian Hermione Giffard, total Jumo 004 production was 6,000 engines, although Antony He indicates roughly 4,000 of the series production B-type. Keeping in mind that each Me-262 required 2, this means that for each of the 1,400 airframes, 3 to 4 engines were made. This availability, rather than the associated performance, was the main advantage of the Jumo engine at this point in time. By the end of the war, the production version of this engine still had a high wastage rate through component failures. A total of 6,100 Jumo 004 engines were produced before the end of the war, while BMW assembled approximately 559 production 003 engines. This delay in the BMW engine is mainly due to development problems and the availability of the correct fuel in 1944, but it is worth noting that early on a lot of hope was placed into this engine. The program had gone ahead primarily with Junkers working on the 109-004 engine, destined to attain production status speedily, and BMW working on a more advanced substitute, the 109-003 engine. The engine had to be produced for about 500 man-hours per unit, that each engine should use no more than 0.6 kilograms of nickel, and that the engine should be broken down into a maximum number of easily made components. The BMW engine was cheaper and less resource intensive compared to the Jumo engine, thus perfect for the Heinkel 162 concept. Yet it was barely entering series production, which left it in a supply deficit given what was required. Nevertheless, the BMW 003 engine had to be adopted for the new Volksjäger simply because all Junkers Jumo 004 production was reserved for the Arado 234 and the Me-262. The BMW engine supply was worsened for 2 reasons. First, it had to be modified from the A to the E model to allow a use in the Heinkel 162. The 109-003A engines were produced in modified forms as the E model to permit installation above a wing or fuselage instead of below a wing. Such a modification is quick to make but caused a split in production, as the E models went to the Heinkel 162 and the A model was now to be used in the Arado 234. Thus, a major problem, next to the poor production quality of the Heinkel 162, was the limited production of the engine powering the aircraft. Here we can see the numbers by K compared to the Jumo 004 engine. Note that this includes both BMW A1 and E1. Nowarra indicates slightly different figures, but provides a ratio breakdown. The highest production output was in March at around 100 units, whereby 60% went to Arado for the Arado 234 and the remaining 40% were built into the Heinkel He-162A2. In terms of turbojet engine production, BMW's success came second to that of Junkers. However, There is every reason to believe that this gap would soon have been closed had there been time. As you will remember, for every Me-262, 4 Heinkel 162s could be built in terms of man hours, or 2 Heinkel 162s in terms of costs. But the question is, did the Germans have enough BMW engines to power those 4 or those 2 Heinkel 162s? And the answer was, at the time of the end of the war, no, they didn't. Yes, the Me-262 might require 2 engines, but for every 262 airframe built, around 3 engines were available. Here you can see the drastic and critical advantage of starting production about half a year earlier. On the flip side, BMW 003 production was barely covering the 162 airframe production, and the situation was not really improving. But we should look at this in more detail if we want to evaluate Messerschmitt's statement that the Heinkel 162 would impair Me-262 production. While Messerschmitt has a point saying that the Heinkel 162 and Me-262 would compete for resources and manpower in October 1944, as we can see from this graph, total aircraft production started to drop significantly in the following months as the German industry shifted production nearly completely to the jets. Production fell significantly due to a mixture of Allied bombing, resource scarcity, and a shift to the jet fighter program. But considering that this, at least on the surface, freed up production space and capacity, a production of both the Heinkel 162 and Me-262 seems feasible, at least on paper. Although most would argue that the development of a new fighter was wasteful and unnecessary, the Volksjäger project was valid at the time, and when you consider the bomber production had ceased, the aircraft manufacturers in Nazi Germany also had the capacity to undertake such a new type. While theoretically correct, and although I understand the point the author of this quote is making, I disagree with this statement on a practical level. While on paper production capacity does free up, in reality this does not automatically allow a shift over to a new aircraft. The existing factories are often under attack or stood, especially in 1945, at a risk of being lost in the ground fighting. So much so that the production had to be relocated underground and dispersed. The Heinkel 162's problems are also made worse by the fact that production was largely focused in mid to sort of North Germany. As such, it was way more vulnerable, for example, to Allied bombing attacks. And then you need to retool your factories, retrain your labor force, and keep the factories running. As an example, actually, in early 1945, Me-262 production had to cease 1 day a week in various factories because electricity had to be rationed. Then, if we consider that due to Allied attacks, the urgency to build these aircraft, the use of slave labor, and the near total collapse of the infrastructure was of course substandard, and this dual production run meant not only producing 2 different aircraft, but 2 different engines. And then we start really running into a massive problem for both aircraft that cannot be overcome given the situation. That being said, I do agree in principle that the Heinkel 162 production, as it happened, did not have sort of a significant impact on Me-262 production because the planes, or the plane, the 162, was designed on purpose to be different to the already existing Me-262s, so as to facilitate a cheaper and less resource-consuming production. Messerschmitt was right in saying we won't get this Volksjäger out in time. But then again, to make a definite statement on most of these things, you have to look beyond costs and man hours, but resource allocation and logistical organization. For example, while Heinkel 162 airframe production had overall probably a limited impact on Me-262 airframe production, BMW 003 production might have had a comparatively bigger impact on Jumo 004 production, or rather vice versa. At the end of the day, we can speculate how the situation would have unfolded in 1945 had the war continued. but thankfully it didn't, and I'm not a fan of these what-if scenarios, so I'm going to cut it here. As always, I am a big fan of going back to some of these original documents, primary sources, and see what was, well, actually said at the time. Let me know what you think about all of this. What do you make of Messerschmitt's attitude towards the Volksjäger? What about the production of both planes and the engine? Yeah, put it down below. And as always, I hope that you enjoy these files that I pull from the archives. More, of course, is coming up. So as always, I want to thank my Patreon and my channel supporters because, well, it's they that fund my research and my filming trips, so I can actually make this content for all of you. If you enjoy it, please consider supporting the channel with $1 or $2 a month over Patreon or channel memberships, and share these videos. Also, a big thank you to the RAF Museum and the Flugwerft Schleißheim near Munich for letting me film the aircraft shown in this video. I recommend that you visit both of these museums when you can. Links in the description below. As always, have a great day and see you in the sky.